Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Tibet House, I would like to welcome you all to the annual Spiritual Ecology Lecture organized by Tibet House, the Culture Center of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, in collaboration with India International Center. Before we begin, I would like to give you a quick overview of Tibet House. Tibet House was founded in 1965 by His Holiness the Dalai Lama to preserve and disseminate the unique cultural heritage of Tibet and to provide a center for Tibetan and Buddhist studies. Tibet House has a museum of valuable Tibetan art and artifacts as well as a library with over 5,000 volumes of manuscripts and books and a conference hall where weekly philosophy classes and monthly lectures are held. Tibet House offers incentives and resources for research and translation projects and publishes important texts. It hosts lectures, conferences, exhibitions, and film screenings. These programs focus on Indian and Tibetan Buddhist history, religion, philosophy, art, literature, and culture, and bear witness to the vital and evolving heritage of the Tibetan people. As His Holiness the Dalai Lama emphasizes universal interdependence and the need to develop a sense of harmony and compassion as the antidote to suffering, his vision has a profound effect on the activities of Tibet House. One focus is on encouraging cross-cultural and inter-religious dialogues, as well as the exploration of relations between science and religion. Another focus is on ecological responsibility for this fragile planet from a Buddhist point of view. Therefore, Tibet House organizes this annual lecture in collaboration with India International Center, keeping in mind the importance of environment conservation and our responsibility as a human being. This annual lecture is delivered by many eminent scholars, writers, environmentalists, activists, and today we have Mr. Sopan Joshi for this year's Spiritual Ecology Lecture. May I now request Mr. Sopan Joshi to come to the dais and take a seat. Mr. Joshi has worked for more than 2 decades as a journalist. Mr. Joshi has traveled to several parts of India and the world, researching on environment, agriculture, water management, forestry, and livestock, among things. He also writes on sports, adventure, and travel occasionally. His first book, titled Jal Thal Mal, was published in July 2016. It explores the science and history of sanitation with a social and environmental perspective. In recent months, he has been preparing children's books on Mahatma Gandhi. He was born in Indore, grew up in Delhi, obtaining a master's degree in English literature from the University of Delhi in 1996. Now, may I request Mr. Joshi to start with his presentation. Thank you.
I'll speak from here. It will be a little easier. Good evening. We were discussing the title of this presentation, and I was a little hesitant because the 2 words in the Spiritual Ecology Lecture, spiritualism and ecology, well, I know very little ecology and I know nothing about spiritualism. So, but there are 2 things I know. I know a little bit about telling stories, and I'm an expert on not knowing. So I decided that the talk can be turned into something about not knowing, and how do we negotiate what we do not know in a place that's rapidly transforming. I said I was going to tell stories, and that's something that journalists know. I mean, it's how they ply their trade. But I learned to tell stories from my grandmother. And my grandmother was illiterate. She'd somehow figured out how to read. She couldn't write. And she used to tell this story about a king who had piles. And he had a bad case of piles. So in that time, whoever was the the Raj Vaidya, the aims of that time, he was summoned, and he held the king's pulse and said, it seems you have a case of piles, and a very bad one. The king said, yes. He said, this looks like a really complicated case, and I need lots of herbs. I need special extracts of special plants. I need the ash of gold and silver and this, that, and the other. So he gave him an elaborate list, and the king immediately dispatched soldiers to obtain all those ingredients. Now, as it happens in these stories, the king used to disguise himself and walk around in the market. So one day the king is walking around the market and he sees the same Vaidya, and he starts following him. So a cowherd stops the Vaidya and tells him that I have a bad case of piles. So the Vaidya doesn't even stop. He just keeps walking, and he tells him, take the leaves of radish, make its juice in the morning and have it on an empty stomach. You'll be fine in a couple of weeks. Now the king hears this and he's a little stunned. So he goes back and he tells his people to give him the juice of radish leaves every morning. And in a couple of weeks, the king is fine. By that time, all the soldiers have come back with the ingredients, and the Vaidya prepares this exotic medicine, and he takes it to the king. So the king says, why don't you feel my pulse? The Vaidya puts his fingers there and says, well, it seems you've recovered. He says, yes, I've recovered. And I saw you say this to the cowherd, and I followed the same thing. Now what I want to know is, why did you trick me? So the Vaidya says, you'll have to first forgive me. I have two things to say. He says, no, nobody will harm you. Go ahead and tell us what you want to tell us. So he says, the first thing, if I would have told you that the remedy is that simple, you wouldn't have taken my advice. You would have summoned another healer. Because kings don't like simple solutions. He started laughing. He said, what's the other thing? He said, a lot of people keep falling unwell and they don't have the means to obtain the herbs that I need. So it's not often that the king falls ill. That's the opportunity I use to obtain my ingredients. Now, along with this, my grandmother always used to say that right after telling the story, she used to say, we don't know in what shape God comes to test us. So whatever we do not know, we must always treat it like the presence of God. Now this helped me understand two things. And that's my hack for spiritualism. Spiritualism is how we negotiate that which we do not know. And spiritualism is the way we deal with ourselves. Now that's not the dictionary definition, but this does help me, and nowhere more so than in any kind of examination of ecology, because we are living in an age where in which we have tons upon tons of information that is rapidly changing everything we believe to be true about ourselves, about our world, about literally everything around us. Well, the image that you see on the screen there, it's representation of the age of the Earth, and it's 4.5 billion years. If you see, the appearance of humans is right on top somewhere, and people who've handled this information, they we live in an age where data has to be represented in understandable forms. So they turn the age of the earth into 1 year, 1 calendar year. If we do that, we find out that humans appeared on the 31st of December at 55 minutes past 11, which means we arrived like some 5 minutes ago. And everything we believe to be true about ourselves, about our world, is constantly getting questioned by study after study, which is asking us, who are we? And one form of that is we're in a season which I call the climate change season. This is around the time when the annual climate conference of party happens, and then there is this talk of the need to save the planet. People who talk about saving the planet, well, the first time we heard this in a big way was in 1992, Rio. Since then, every year we are told this is the last chance to save the planet. And we've, by now, lost out on at least 25 of those chances to save the planet. And yet, every December, there is a glut of information on what we need to do, on how to obtain a credible deal to negotiate climate change, and we haven't succeeded. As a species, we haven't succeeded that. A lot of people say it's the greatest challenge that humankind has ever faced. Now, we all hear about environmental destruction around us, and we get those stories in several forms, and a lot of them have to do with the coming of the industrial age, how we rapidly began to consume resources, and how that has changed our world. But actually, there is a much longer history to this, to the kind of changes we've brought about to our planet. And they go back at least 50,000 years. Some scientists estimate this is about 70,000 years. And around that time, there were a lot of large animals roaming most of our continents. A lot of these animals were bigger than their counterparts that exist in our world today. There were bears about 50% bigger than today's largest bears. There were lions. There was a marsupial rhinoceros in Australia. There were saber-tooths. There were kangaroos that were bigger than today's kangaroos. And all of them disappeared. A huge number of them just disappeared. And nobody knows how. They started disappearing in a big way around 50,000 years ago. There were about 4 theories to explain this a few years ago. Some said it was diseases, some said it was climate change. And then, this is just to give you a sense of the kind of animals we are dealing with here. This was a wombat in Australia. So our ancestors obviously saw these animals. There were mastodons and there were mammoths, and we've seen their images on cave walls. But a scientist called Paul S. Martin made a graph that put a chronology on the extinction of these species as observed in the fossil record. And then he made another time scale of a new species that had begun to appear in that continent at that time. And you can see that that's the first graph on your left. On each continent, Africa, Australia, North America, Madagascar, as soon as this species enters, which is represented by that black arrow, there is a steep drop in the number of megafauna species, large animals. Steep drop everywhere. The last place this happened was on Madagascar, the island of Madagascar. This was, I guess, about 2,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago. And Paul Martin proposed a theory which is now called the overkill hypothesis, and there's increasing evidence to support the overkill hypothesis. Not climate change, not diseases. It seems that the moment humans reached a new continent, large animals just began to die. And animals much more powerful than us. Animals with claws, large claws, strong jaws. Now, we haven't yet understood how the two things are linked. The evidence doesn't explain everything, but with each year there is mounting evidence that in one way or the other we finished off these animals. One way to explain that is the use of fire, which denuded large tracts and then just destroyed the habitat, and we knew how to control fire for a very long time. But the other slightly newer hypothesis is what is called the ER theory, or the ER hypothesis, endurance running. This says that we were built to run, and our natural range, for humans in a day is 200 to 250 kilometers. That's the distance we can run in a day. So we didn't actually need to hunt these large animals and really use very sophisticated tools to kill them. We just ran them to their deaths. The ER theory is actually based on comparisons of older hominoids, specifically Australopithecines, and they settled on this theory because all the other hominoids are dead. We are the last. This is a theory called the last ape standing. We are the last hominoid around today, and they say we survive because we are built to run long distances, whereas the earlier ones were built to climb trees. Likewise, something new that is coming up, we've been around in this present shape for at least 200,000 years. The oldest fossils of Homo sapiens are about 200,000 years old. But only over the last 10,000 years have we managed to succeed as a species. Agriculture, temples, settlements, everything is 10,000 years old. And something happened around 10,000 years ago that changed things and made them very suitable to us. And that's what scientists call the Holocene. It's an interglacial period of remarkable stability. And by now we have, this paper analyzed climate data for about 400,000 years. Now we have data for 800,000 years. And we know that there is no comparable period of climatic stability in 800,000 years that can be compared with the Holocene. The Holocene is completely new. And it has made things so suitable to us that we've been able to thrive, we've been able to compete with other species and finish them off. How we finish them off got explained in 1995 when wolves were reintroduced in the Yellowstone National Park. Yellowstone was perhaps the first modern national park in the world, and The wolves there had been exterminated about in the 1930s. And in 1995, there was a federal government-sponsored program to bring back wolves, which were the top predators in this area. They were brought in from Canada, and as soon as the wolves appeared, the entire forest began to change, because the wolves started chasing the deer. There was less grazing, especially in the valleys where the rivers flowed. And once the rivers stabilized, the banks stabilized, a whole range of species returned. Otters came back, beavers came back, bears came back, and they again drove away all the herbivores away from the valleys. And in no time, the forest was regenerating. The trees shot up within 5 years. And this showed, this established what is called trophic cascade, which is how one species can influence an entire food web. When a species as small as the wolf can so drastically alter a landscape, you can imagine the kind of impact that large, that megafauna, almost twice or thrice the size of the wolf, could have had on that ecology, and how their extinction rapidly transformed the landscape. Another example of what trophic cascades can do comes from the Southern Ocean, and this is a more recent discovery. The scientist involved was actually born in India, and he carried out his research at the Alfred Wegener Institute of Polar and Marine Sciences in Bremerhaven, Germany. He's one of the top marine ecologists in the world, Victor Smetacek. And Victor grew up as a young boy in Bhimtal, and he was actually called by villagers when elephants used to get very aggressive and they used to destroy farms and villages. Victor used to be called to shoot them down, so he was like a poor man's Jim Corbett in the same area. Now, after Victor had started researching on the oceans, came across this, he got interested in whale populations. And for those of you who know this, since the beginning of the industrial age, there has been whaling has just stripped the oceans of some species, and it became so bad that hunters themselves got together and decided to impose some kind of a moratorium, and then the International Whaling Commission came into being to restrict whaling. Now, the largest whales tend to come from the Southern Ocean, and they are all baleen whales. They have these comb-like baleens in front of their jaws. They open that, they gulp a lot of water, and then they ram their tongue against the baleen, which lets out the water, and they can eat the krill which gets trapped. The blue whale is the biggest, and that is a baleen whale. Now, the biggest whales have all been around in the Southern Ocean because the Southern Ocean always had lots of krill. So scientists began to investigate how the krill populations were doing in the absence of whales. Because when the predator was gone, it was assumed that krill would thrive. Instead, they found an 80% drop in krill population. When the species was not being hunted, it was getting driven I mean, its population was just dropping rapidly. Now, this mystery got solved several years after this. And there's another scientist called Martin in this. Scientist called John Martin, who proposed that the oceans are deficient in iron, which is why coastal waters tend to support more life, because iron is it's found in dust that is blown from the land. So waters close to the continents have iron, and so they support more life. But the deep oceans don't get enough iron. And Victor found out that the reason you had such a thriving population of krill in the Southern Ocean was the iron they were getting from whale excreta, which meant that the whales were actually fertilizing the ocean, and if you are willing to stretch the definition of agriculture, growing their own food with their excreta. Now, this has promising ramifications for climate change, because if you can seed the oceans with iron, and that iron can lead to then a spurt in the population of the phytoplankton, which would then feed a whole lot of zooplankton, which would then feed a whole lot of diatoms, which would then feed a whole lot of krill. You can actually bump up the population of whales, and in the dying off of the diatoms, reduce the carbon content in the water. Actually, the Indian government and the German government have been trying out. They've held 2 phases of these experiments, and they are called LOHA-FEX. They've been trying out spreading iron in the oceans. What is also relevant here is the whales actually they excrete very close to the surface, because in the depths of the oceans the pressure is so high that you actually can't put anything out of your body. So they rise to the surface and they release the iron where there is sunlight, and that is assumed to trigger. You see, this is a whale practicing open defecation, and this was the Indo-German project, which has tried to find out to establish whether this is a good way to deal with climate change. The results are all out, they're promising, but this little story of iron actually shows how we're actually very small units in these large nutrient cycles, which regulate, which actually run, which control our lives, and we think that we control them. It's actually the other way around. These cycles are far bigger than us. Their time scales are unimaginable for us. And one example of that came out in 2009 when a bunch of 28 well-known scientists brought out a paper called the Planetary Boundaries paper. This established 9 planetary boundaries which were very important for our survival. And if any of these boundaries begin to be breached, then our survival is threatened. And you can see those 9 boundaries. The first is biodiversity loss, and we talked about this earlier, species extinctions. That's already happening at a scale that's beyond both our imagination and our ability to stop it. The second cycle, which is out of control, as you'll notice, is not the carbon cycle. It's not climate change. It's the nitrogen cycle. And you'll see a small little bump in the phosphorus cycle right next to it. Now this tells a story that is again one of the least appreciated stories of our success. Just one invention about 100 years ago is responsible for our population explosion. About half, at least 40% of the current human population feeds off food that is grown as a direct result of that one invention, and that is the Haber-Bosch process. It's how we can draw nitrogen from the air and fix it and make it available to us as urea. Now this one invention hasn't only changed the way we eat, it's also changed the way we fight. Because nitrogen is the key ingredient of TNT, armaments. And the fertilizer industry has long been known to be deeply tied to what's called the government industrial complex that likes wars. Because the explosion of factories that produce artificial nitrogen happened during the wars. Fritz Haber discovered invented a tabletop contraption to fix nitrogen in 1908. In 1913, Karl Bosch, nephew of the great Bosch, had created an industrial scale plant to fix nitrogen. The next year, Germany went to war. And it was a big mystery for the Allies about how Germany was growing its food and how it was making its arms. That only became apparent later when they realized that they'd cracked the nitrogen mystery. At this point, Europe used to get its fertilizers from South America. Actually, it was guano, bird shit. For those of you who remember their James Bond, Dr. No, Julius No uses the guano trade as cover for his nefarious activities. And guano trade was about as crucial to the discovery and settlement of the South Pacific as spices were to India. All manner of European adventurers were out looking for ways to first get guano and then get saltpeter. And this is what was feeding the exploding population of industrial Europe. And these reserves were dying out. Once Germany went to war, there was a naval blockade, and it did not have access to saltpeter from Chile. But Germany kept on fighting because Germany had the source of artificial nitrogen. After the war in 1919, both Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch were given the Nobel Prize in chemistry. And this is the one invention which has changed our world. About half our population today exists because we can grow several times more food. The estimate is around 5 times as much food on the same amount of land as earlier. But this means there is a lot of reactive nitrogen that we are constantly putting out in our biosphere. And there are some nitrogen compounds that are several times more dangerous in terms of the greenhouse effect than carbon gases. So what we're looking at is a nitrogen glut and a paucity of iron in the oceans. Now, is there a way to fix it? We live in an age where what is the solution is you talk about anything and people say, no, tell us, talk about solutions, be positive. Now the weird thing in here is there are solutions all around us, but we don't see them. We don't see them because nobody stands to profit from the solutions. They are not business solutions. And perhaps the most beautiful solution to this anywhere in the world is to be found in Kolkata. Kolkata has a remarkable sewage treatment system, which the city had actually completely forgotten about. In sometime around the early 1980s, there was a circular from the union government to all state governments asking them to find out ways to profitably use sewage, grey water. So this task in West Bengal was handed over to a slightly eccentric officer called Dhrubajyoti Ghosh. Now Dhrubajyoti Ghosh was about to leave for Bombay because the first sewage treatment plant in India was set up in Dadar in Bombay. So he was going to Dadar to find out how to treat sewage. When he just stopped and asked himself, the most important questions are the ones we ask ourselves. He stopped and asked himself, what if the people in Mumbai ask me, how does Calcutta treat its sewage? So he went around his office and he started asking, and nobody knew. So he was then working at the state planning board. Nobody in the state planning board knew what was happening to the city's sewage. So he went to the municipality, and nobody there knew. Then he went to government departments, and he realized nobody has an idea about what happens to Kolkata's sewage. So I told you he's an eccentric man. One day he decided to take a walk. He just started walking next to the sewer lines, and he hit a large drain which takes, if you see the map, you'll see there's a blue line, straight line, right in the middle, going east. The city of Kolkata is on the eastern bank of the Hooghly River, and the slope is naturally eastward because the Hooghly has been depositing silt on either of its banks, whereas the river that used to provide silt to the region east of Kolkata, it's called the Vidyadhari, is a dead river. It was killed by sewage. It was killed by the first modern sewage system built by the East India Company. Well, it began under the East India Company, and then the British government took over. It was launched in 1803. It was completed in 1895. And by the 1920s, the river was dead. Vidyadhari is a very old river. There is a 2,300-year-old town on its banks called Chandrapur, going back to the Mauryan times. But a long time ago, the main channel of the Ganga used to flow through here. But then some say it was an earthquake, some say, some cite other reasons, but the river started flowing westward. So once this area stopped getting water, it became a lowland marsh, and the term for this area was salt lakes, because it became so low that the tide used to bring in seawater, and saltwater fish started thriving in this area. Now, once the sewage started flowing in, it started pushing the salt water out. Nobody knew all this. I mean, all this is Dhrubajyoti Ghosh's research. We know this now. But when he was just walking down that drain, he came across a dam. Well, not a dam, it's just a sluice gate, which raises the level of Kolkata sewage and directs it northwards. As he went along, he saw this grey water is kept standing in shallow ponds, which in Bangla are called bheris. And they are shallow because the interplay of sunlight and bacteria creates ideal conditions for algae. And there are blooms of algae in this water, which is then directed towards, once the nutrient load comes down and the nutrients turn into the algae, the water is moved to the next bheri, where fish is grown in that water. About half of Kolkata's fish comes from its own sewage. That's one of the reasons Kolkata has the cheapest food among any major city in India. There is still nutrient remaining in this water. It's taken to paddy fields. There is, not too far from the paddy fields is a village called Dhapa, where Kolkata's garbage is brought and segregated, and vegetables are grown there. And once you consider these things, you can understand why Kolkata has cheap food. Even the poorest in Kolkata tend to eat better than their counterparts in other Indian cities. Now, for the fishermen here, the sewage is a gift. The only problem is when they're not being provided sewage. I've seen a man test the nutrient content of this sewage by sipping it. And nobody is forcing this man to do it. It's not like the Safai Karamcharis who die in their 10s and 20s in our cities because they have no option but to dive inside sewers to open the blockages. They're not like that at all. They're very proud of what they do. They don't ask for any help from the government. And they provide unknown benefits to the cities. They're so this hasn't even been studied properly, but about 12 years ago, Dhrubajyoti Ghosh did a rudimentary assessment. And he found that the city gets goods and services worth 200 crores from the East Kolkata wetlands every year, including what it saves from not having to treat its sewage. But in all the talk of sanitation that we see today, you will not see the fishermen of Kolkata being discussed. They're not putting out their nitrogen into the rivers. They're taking the nitrogen out. They are providing cheap food to the poorest in Kolkata, because this is actually the cheapest fish in the city. And people who can't afford fish brought from outside, this is their best source of protein. They close the loop, meaning they don't let nutrients from land escape into the oceans. If we begin to forget about nitrogen, let's look at a smaller nutrient like phosphorus. Phosphorus, first of all, animals know where there's phosphorus. Animals actually walk trails following phosphorus in the forest or in grasslands. Now, phosphorus on land gets recycled an average of 48 times, which means there's phosphorus, or there's vegetation. The vegetation is eaten by herbivorous animals. Those animals either shit or they die. Their carcasses are eaten by other animals. And gradually it goes back into the soil. That's one cycle. Phosphorus gets recycled like this on an average 48 times on land, after which it gets washed to the sea. Now, the oceans, unlike the continents, are, there's more vegetation on land and fewer animals. In the oceans, there are more animals, and there is, the rates of vegetation are far lower. So, in the oceans, phosphorus gets recycled an average of 800 times, which means it's food. Some animals eat that food. Those animals are eaten by other animals. Those animals are eaten by other animals, and then it comes back. After this 800 times, the phosphorus settles on the ocean floor. And then you have to wait for tectonic movement to bring up that phosphorus. That takes millions of years. India is the fastest plate in the world, tectonic plate. It's called the Cheetah Plate by geologists. And it's separated from Gondwana between 120 and 90 million years ago. It took India 90 million years to reach where we are today. Those are the kind of timescales we're looking at to get back the phosphorus that we simply flush down the toilet, down to the river, and then to the sea. Now, the biggest importer of phosphorus is India. Our annual phosphorus import bill tends to be around 20,000 crores. And just two countries have about 80% of the phosphorus deposits, Morocco and China. Morocco, as I'm sure you're aware, is ruled by one family. We all know what's been happening in North Africa. So if there is a democratic revolution in Morocco, God knows what's going to happen to our phosphorus supply. Because the family that rules Morocco actually has reserves the rights to all the phosphorus reserves. The US has a big mine for phosphate in Florida near Miami, but that is going to be exhausted in about 20 to 30 years. China doesn't even use its own phosphate right now. China is importing. Because when the imports dry up is when China intends to dip into its own phosphate reserves. Now when you look at this, you realize we're actually not self-sufficient in food. We're all brought up on this grand story of the Green Revolution, where we were begging for food grain, and then we started producing enough food grain. Yes, we are producing all the food grain we need and more, but that's because we are importing phosphate. Phosphate that we are otherwise putting in our water bodies and just losing it. So there are people who look at, like you have peak oil, there are people who look at peak phosphorus. And the estimates say the world will lose its phosphate reserves between 70 to 130 years. Now, these are little hints into the unknown. Little examples of what ecology, the field of ecology is telling us about ourselves, about our world, about what we know and what we don't know. Because the more data we get, the more we tend to understand things, the bigger the mysteries seem to become. Now, my talk is about the unknown. So, there's already one example of how people who don't tend to know all that much, ordinary farmers, many of them illiterate, have one of the most impressive ecological systems anywhere in the world. But are there other examples that can help us deal with the big unknown? Well, I told you that all I know is stories. So there is this story about the monsoon. For the biggest part, in this land, the monsoon has been called Chaumasa or Chaturmas. 4 months. Now, there is a story that comes from the Bhagavata Purana. It has to do with Indra, the god of rain. The story goes something like this. Krishna's father, Nanda Baba, is about to organize a big yagya. So the 7-year-old boy comes to him and says, "What is this yagya for?" And the father tells the son, "This is to placate Indra." So he says, "Why do we need to keep Indra happy?" So he said, "Well, Indra controls the rains." So Krishna tells him, "What is this? I mean, if we live by our karma," and this is believed to be the oldest exposition on karma. He says, if we live by our karma, then why do we need to keep this wicked God happy? This God who who makes us or breaks us by a whim. Now Krishna is a persuasive boy, so Nand decides, okay, we are not going to, this puja is not dedicated to Indra. So who do we dedicate it to? So he says, well, Govardhan. We seem to get everything we need from this hill. We get fodder, it protects us. So the puja is dedicated to Govardhan. And as soon as the puja is over, Indra decides to strike. There are 7 days and 7 nights of constant rain, and the entire region is flooded. So what does Krishna do? Well, he goes to Govardhan. Now this story has been internalized by millions of people, and nowhere more so than in Rajasthan. One of the names for Krishna is Marudhar, which means the one who carries the desert. I haven't found one temple to Indra in Rajasthan. And you will find there is no deity as popular as Krishna there. Because people in the desert knew, they remembered the lesson that Krishna had taught them. Which is, it's not the vagaries of the gods. It's what you do with it. It's what you do with the little rain you get. So, what you see, this little wheel is called bhoon in several Rajasthani languages. Right? This is what the rope works to draw the water. And there is an old saying in Rajasthan. It says, "Bhoon tharo 12 mas, Indra thari ek ghadi." Indra will send down a few moments of rainfall, but the bhoon will give you water through the year. This is, if you read the most recent material available on dealing with climate change, it will tell you that this is what you need to do to drought-proof yourself. This is the attitude you need to have to deal with the kind of changes that are imminent due to climate change. And people were already, they'd geared themselves up to deal with all kinds of changes. And they weren't waiting for the gods. Their favorite god was the man who taught the most popular lesson in ecology. Look after your trees, look after your fodder, look after your karma. Just one example of how it is possible to deal with what we don't know, with a little beauty, with beautiful stories, with some elegance. I think my time is up, and I should end here. Thank you so much for your patience, and thank you to the Tibet House for organizing this lecture. Are we to do question answers after this? So in case anybody has questions,
that probably across the globe, in populations who have been there throughout the history. I'm not talking about the new land findings and new population being settled. The civilizational pockets and people who have been living there for ages. In their traditional storytelling, they have got so many stories and so many lessons probably weaved into their culture on eco-sensitivity, and that is just fascinating. It does amaze quite a lot. I did a small bit of work during the tsunami evaluation after the Indian Ocean tsunami in Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Maldives, that side, and I realized that near Aceh, Nias, the biggest the largest number of people who died were in the metro or Aceh or like the city or thing, but in remote islands where there were tribals, there were people who were just cut off. Even though the waves went over the islands, they managed to survive because of one fable which they used to actually sing like a lullaby. That when the sky is red and birds are restless, and if the earth shakes, you must run to the hilltop. It's a lullaby. It's amazing. And while you are going through these lovely stories that we are going through, I mean, maybe in Andaman also, yeah, of course. But in Andamans in Jarawa, we don't know. I mean, we know for sure they survived, but must have been some internal. Yeah, and it's only 170 nautical miles actually from the western tip of Indonesia, in that way. So awesome! Thank you so much. And maybe you are a storyteller, you are a good story listener, and maybe it's high time that we just try to figure out the right set of stories and pass it on to our kids in the right way that we have forgotten to. Thank you.
Stephen Jay Gould, the well-known evolutionary biologist, has this little phrase, says, humans are primates who tell stories. Right? And storytelling is key to who we are. Storytelling is also a more relaxed way to deal with the unknown, because stories leave a lot of margin. I get to travel a fair bit across the country, and I find that people who are not educated have a far greater margin to deal with things. Somehow we've decided in our commitment to knowledge, in our we intend to know with a vengeance, but we don't know what to do with what we know. For 25 years we've been clobbering. Our heads of state have been at it at the climate conferences, and we can't hammer out a decent deal to deal with climate change, right? And that's the best. It's the best researchers, it's the best scientists, it's the best negotiators. We can't do it. And you mentioned that in during the tsunami in the Indian Ocean, there are all these stories of they're called indigenous people. because we are people. Those who are not like us need an adjective. They can't be just people. So, there were stories of them because the waters first receded before the tsunami. As the waters gather force, they first recede. And they had this in their memory. That's what's said, that in their community memory, that when the waters recede, don't run into the water, run the other way. It's counterintuitive. I don't know if you saw the images from this, from the West Indies during this last big cyclone. There's an entire island with no water around it, because the cyclone had taken away all the water. Now, we live in this bubble that we actually understand things, that we actually know. Till about 5 to 6 years ago, I wasn't aware that most of our world is built around a single invention, the Haber-Bosch process, which has transformed both food and war. And there is no invention after that of that scale. For example, we hear so much about water. There is a lot of funding in water these days. But water is simple, hydrogen and oxygen, H2O. Why can't we make water? When we have so much science, so much technology, why can't we just make water? We can't. Every single drop of water that we see around us has been around for billions of years. From around the time which geologists called the late heavy bombardment. And it's believed, there are two theories in this, but it's believed that it was asteroids that brought water to the earth. And since then there is no water. You know, the one time there was the one example of actually creating water. It's when the Hindenburg exploded. It was full of hydrogen. And hydrogen is flammable. So when it exploded, I believe 37 people were killed. When it exploded, there was enough energy around it to use oxygen and the hydrogen in that to make water. That's the only known. We can't make water. We believe we know. It's an illusion. I mean, there's that oft-quoted story of an Aboriginal people in Australia who don't have the terms left, right, front, or behind. They don't have those terms. If they are asking you to, if you were a member of that tribe and somebody wanted you to lift that phone, they'll probably tell you, will you lift the phone that is lying to the south of you? Because they have such a sharp sense of direction that at all times, whether they're indoors or outdoors, they know their directions. So they don't even have terms for left, right, front, behind. They'll say west, north, or southwest. And people who talk about languages, that's what they always argue, that
How destroyed are we by the Gregorian calendar?
time calculation. Very. Well,
Totally destroyed.
if you look at the term for year in Sanskrit and Hindi, it's Varsh. That's linked to Varsha. Because we are people of the monsoon. We always knew this. I used to wonder why in most Hindu communities and other religions as well, I've noticed this among some Muslim communities as well, you don't have any weddings during the monsoon. And then I remembered a story that my grandmother had told me. It's always the stories. It's the story of Vaman Avatar, when Vishnu comes down as Vaman. And there is Mahabali, the king, who is so pious that the current Indra is absolutely insecure that his government is going to come down. So he hires Vishnu to do the dirty job for him. And Vishnu lands up there Bali knows that the little Brahmin who's come to him is Vishnu, but he still, because he's this generous and pious soul, he grants him his 3 wishes and he says, land worth 3 steps. So in 1 step he finishes off this world, 2nd step he finishes off the afterworld, the heavens, and he says, where do I put my 3rd step? So Bali says, put it here. And then Bali goes into the underworld. Sutal is called. But then there are other variations of the story which say that after meeting Bali, Vishnu comes back and tells the current Indra, whose name is Purandar, by the way. Purandar also means thief. He comes back and tells Purandar that, listen, this guy is better than you. So he is going to be the next Indra. And the story has been internalized by all people, and the common term for this is Dev so rahe hain. So there is actually a Dev Shayani Ekadashi before the monsoon. When the gods go to sleep, they leave the people at peace to handle their land, to handle their water bodies. People don't have to bother about their gods.
What about the dam?
And when do they wake up? The gods wake up 11 days after Diwali. Devutthana Ekadashi. In common parlance, it's called Dev Soni Gyaras, Dev Uthni Gyaras. In the scriptures, it's Dev Shayani Ekadashi and Dev Utthan Ekadashi. But it's a lovely story to understand where you live, what are the physical conditions like. And depending on the amount of time, how are we, should we call time here? Or we have time for a little story? Okay, so the nicest story that has to do with hydrology, I found in Tulsidasa's Ramcharitmanas. It's in the 13th verse of Kishkinda Kand, 4:13th. And it's a lovely story. Ram and Lakshman are wandering around the forest and there is a downpour. The skies really open up and they have to seek refuge. So Ram, in a sense, begins to rap. And he says, Ghanagavanda Nabagarjat Ghora, Priya Heen Darpat Manmora. Now this, mind you, is the man who broke Shiva's bow. But he says, I feel scared because my lover, not my wife, not my queen, my lover is not there with me. I feel scared. Then he says, Damini damak rahan ghan mahi, khalke preeti jatha thir nahi. Like lightning flashes across the sky and disappears, you can't trust the love, and I'll add knowledge, of the wicked. He says, Barsahi jalad bhumi niyar aaye, jatha na bhai buddh vidya paaye. Like a productive patch of land receives water when the clouds come down, the knowledgeable attain knowledge when they are in the company of the learned. Jatha na vahi buddh vidya paaye. Boond aghat sahahi giri kaise. Why don't the mountains erode with such a, in the midst of such a downpour? Boond aghat sahahi giri kaise. Khalke bachan sant sah jaise. Like a saint just tolerates the babble of the wicked. It says, Bhumi paratbha dhabar pani, Januji mahimaya laptani. On an unproductive patch of land, if you get water, what does it result in? Kichad. It says, Samiti samiti jal bharahi talaba, Jimmy sadgun sajjan pahi In a good water body, you collect water drop by drop. And likewise, the learned attain what they know drop by drop. Just like you mentioned, what is called traditional knowledge of indigenous people. I find these adjectives very, very disturbing. Because what I know is knowledge. What you know is a different kind of knowledge which needs an adjective. My people are people. Your people need an adjective. So you will not find it goes on, it says, Varsha jal jal nidhi pahunchai, ho hi adham jim jiv hari pai. Like the waters come from the ocean and rain on the clouds and then the rivers take it back. All living beings come from the divine and go back to the divine. Now these stories, you'll find they're more helpful to explain, say, the phosphorus cycle or the nitrogen cycle, which otherwise is just unimaginable for us. I mean, nitrogen cycle is one of the craziest things to understand. But this kind of...
I think that's why you like the unknown. I think the unknown
Yes.
in your lecture
Yes.
is a very positive term.
It's a very positive term. It's the only place where I see hope. I see hope in the unknown. You know, I see hope in a king disguised in a market. I see hope in a doctor who can tell the king that when you fall ill, I use it to procure medicines for the poor. The unknown is what keeps us alive. It's what gives us hope. It's what we should appreciate a little more. Because most of the time when we fight, it's on the basis of what we know.
I just wish to say one more thing, which is that if you negotiate the unknown,
Yeah.
you can't be self-regarding. You have to be other.
Unknown is the other.
You have to be other.
And the fundamental lesson here is that accepting the unknown is in a way letting go of the duality of self and other. It's accepting that what we know comes from the unknown and it is going to go back into the unknown. That all we know is
Just like our shit.
just like our shit. Well, time is up. Thank you so much for your interest and for patiently listening to this. Is the tea outside? Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Joshi, for the wonderful lecture. So now, on behalf of Tibet House, we would like to present a souvenir as a token of gratitude.
Thank you. I'll come on.